the West has promised to continue tightening economic sanctions on Moscow as part of efforts to deter the Russian president. But could more be done? Cities have been destroyed, lives lost, and evidence has emerged to suggest war crimes have been committed. At what point does the West say Mr. Putin has gone too far? I'm Trevor Phillips, and this is The Great Debate. Tonight, nearly 7 weeks on from the invasion of Ukraine, our viewers panel from across the country and indeed across the world will have their say. They'll tell their stories. While joining us here in the studio this week are Lord Ricketts, the UK's former National Security Advisor and former British Ambassador to NATO. UK Director of Human Rights Watch, Yasmin Ahmed. Chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee, Tobias Elwood. And from Washington, Melinda Herring, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Centre. The question facing us all tonight, is the West letting Putin get away with it?
You can see what's left of the missile. Just to focus on the words on the side of that missile, Zadeti, it means for the children.
The attack at the train station in eastern Ukraine shows the depths to which Putin's once vaunted army has sunk.
We will see more examples of killing of civilians, which are war crimes.
Russia's crimes in Ukraine will not go unpunished.
A mass grave for what Ukraine has called a massacre.
They've been shot in the head with the tied hands behind their back.
We deny that Russian military can have something in common with these atrocities.
It's some sort of huge conspiracy, a propaganda stunt. Do you realize how grotesque that sounds?
It's not a conspiracy, actually. It's a bold fake.
The Kremlin may want the world to believe this is fake news, but the evidence of Russia's rampage is all too real.
OK, let's start, as ever, with our viewers panel and talk to Anton Ivashik. Anton, what has been your experience?
Okay, can you hear me well?
We can hear you perfectly well. Go ahead.
Cool. So my family lived in Bucha before the active state of war, before the war came to Bucha. And it came early in February 24, and we tried to analyze everything, and we decided to stay in our house. Actually, now we know that that was wrong solution, but we decided to stay, as well as the family of my sister. She lived in Bucha as well. So fightings were mainly air fightings, were everywhere. Bucha is located close to the Hostomel airport, and that was their target for that day. And fightings were everywhere. So we decided to leave Bucha the next day, February 25. And that was very good solution, because we left Bucha at the middle of the day, and after that some street fightings became.
Let's go to Olena Lietvatska.
Hello, Trevor.
Good evening, Olena.
Can you hear me well?
We can hear you perfectly well.
Wonderful.
I think you've got a comment and a thought and a question for our studio panel.
I do. First of all, I want to say thank you to Anton for sharing his experience with us. And he's an example of thousands of innocent Ukrainians who have been forced out of their homes and much worse. I have been attending daily protests at Trafalgar Square and Downing Street since the start of the war. And together with our London activists, I have organized a protest outside of Russian embassy last week. We have been demanding more significant action and more help from the West. And if the war crimes in Bucha, Kramatorsk, Mariupol, and other places do not make the world intervene, it really breaks my heart to think nothing will. The West must act now. We need to disarm Russia on the ground, in the air, and in the media. And it is important that Western media does not provide a platform to propaganda spreaders like Peskov. So for now, my question to the panel is, when will the West say enough is enough and take real action against Russia?
Well, Lena, thank you so much for that very direct question there from Elena Liotowska. And that question to our panel is, when will the West say enough is enough and take real action against Russia? Peter Ricketts.
Well, enough is enough, and I think the West has been acting. We have been arming Ukraine with more and more advanced weapons. But to stop Russia, to disarm Russia, to apply a no-fly zone to Russia would mean NATO going to war with Russia. I mean, that's, I'm afraid, the stark reality of the position. I think that the West is prepared to do everything short of that, economic sanctions, military support. But let's not underplay the risk of any NATO military action against Russian forces in Ukraine.
Isn't that tantamount to saying, in truth, all we can do is watch Ukraine lose slowly?
No, it's not saying that, because we have played our part in allowing the Ukrainian forces to defend so effectively against the Russians. They've been magnificently brave, and part of the reason they've been successful is very modern Western weapons, and the economic sanctions on Russia will also play. But I do not think that Western leaders are ready to take their countries into direct war with Russia, with all the risks that come with that, including, right at the end of the spectrum, the possibility even of Putin using nuclear weapons.
Melinda Herring.
So I think Lord Ricketts had a point last week, but the situation has changed. So phase one is over. Vladimir Putin tried to take over Ukraine for 6 weeks, and he failed. He only got one city, the city of Kherson. That's it. There were massive losses of life on the Russian side. The Russians got their butts kicked, just to summarize, and they have withdrawn to Belarus and to the Donbass. We expect them to make a major push in the Donbass this week, but the way that the war is going to happen in the Donbass is going to be different than it was in the first phase. The second phase, I'm sorry to say, favors the Russians because Ukrainians don't have the same kind of multiple launch rocket systems and the kind of gear that Russia has, which is why Defense Minister Reznikov from the Ukrainian side is begging for additional gear. So I think Lord Ricketts was right up to a point, but that's no longer true now. We must do more now. And there's a real tipping point. This point in the Donbass is going to be very, very crucial. Russia has about 2 to 3 months left of capable military men. If the Ukrainians can wage war and hold their territory, they can get a real deal at the negotiating table, but much depends on what happens in the Donbass.
Melinda, thank you. I'm going to come back in studio in a moment and ask if time's running out, but I want to talk to our viewers panel again and come to Paul Peachy. Paul, what do you think? Is Vladimir Putin being let off the hook?
Well, if you appease Putin, he will never stop. So we must do all we can to stop him and stop him as quickly as possible. Now, in my view, the UK has been leading the response to this war. I'm no fan of the Prime Minister, but he is showing leadership now. He's being decisive, timely, effective.
Thank you very much, Paul. Tobias Ellwood, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Prime Minister made a big gesture this weekend and actually put some guns, literally, behind it. But what do you think about Melinda's point that actually the situation now is so different, it may not be enough?
Yeah, we are moving into, I'm afraid, an uglier phase of this war, this invasion. Russian troops are removing themselves from the north, but they're, as we've just heard, they're then pushing into the Donbass area and probably into the Odessa area too. If the port of Odessa falls, then the Ukraine's grain, which is so critical for the rest of the world, won't be able to get out, and Ukraine's economy then will fall. What I would say is that Putin took a gamble on whether his troops could actually take over Ukraine. Clearly that wasn't going to happen. I was in the country a week before the invasion, and there was an absolute determination for the Ukrainian people to stay and fight. And they asked me the question, will NATO be there to support us? We're part of Europe. We're a European democracy. And Putin was spot on in recognizing that there will be timidity, there'll be a risk averseness of NATO not willing to step in. And we're now seeing the consequences of our hesitance. And we need to become bolder, create a sort of a Cold War statecraft capability to be able to stand up to Putin, knowing that there is an escalatory ladder, but also knowing that if we don't support the Ukrainians, don't stop Putin now, it won't stop in Ukraine, it will go further. That's the bigger picture security challenge that we now face. We've entered a new era of insecurity. We've got to wake up to that.
There's a lot of support on the wall for that view, as expressed by Tobias Ell, but Yasmin Ahmed, do you accept Melinda's point that we've perhaps reached a tipping point now where the rules that everybody agreed 8 days ago cannot apply going forward?
Well, certainly from Human Rights Watch's perspective, we have been documenting the violations and war crimes, apparent war crimes that are being committed on the ground. So we have been in a number of these cities, and obviously we saw as the Russians withdrew from some of the areas that they were occupying some horrendous scenes, including evidence of summary executions, sexual violence and rape, torture and other such things. So I think certainly what we're seeing now is an escalation in terms of also the human suffering on the ground. And certainly it's one thing from our perspective as Human Rights Watch is to ensure that the evidence about what is happening and by whom is collated, collected and preserved for any future accountability.
I'm going to come to Stephen Fairley. Stephen, an old friend of the programme. Stephen, what do you think?
I mean, I've listened to the comments tonight. I mean, my views on it was that, I feel that we are doing as much as we can without actually putting boots on the ground. Listening to the comments, it's sort of swaying me a little bit towards, is there more that we can do? I know that we've focused in this side of Europe on sanctions, and what I was thinking was the sanctions have only been in place primarily maybe 5-6 weeks. I know the war started maybe 7 weeks ago, but we started putting the sanctions in. They must, we knew, Boris was saying for weeks and weeks before Russia tried to invade Ukraine, that it was happening. So Russia had a lot of money put by to fund this war. And we can't expect Russia to run out of money so quickly. We have to wait and see if the sanctions are actually going to impact them. And it looks like it may be doing that as we're going forward. It still doesn't mean that we're doing the right thing with regards to putting boots on the ground, etc. But I think the sanctions need to be... there's still 200 banks in the world who are still taking money on behalf of Russia for oil and gas.
Okay.
Why are these banks still taking money from European countries? Why are they not being stopped as well?
Thank you, Stephen. Peter, I think this is a difficult piece of territory and it's a difficult judgment to make. But, and Stephen, I think, broadly would support what you said. But do you see the point that's being made that actually maybe the game has changed, the circumstances have changed enough for us to essentially accept greater risk than we might have done a month ago?
Well, I absolutely agree that the situation has changed, and I agree that we're now moving into an even worse phase, if that's possible, for the people of Ukraine as the fighting moves into the Donbass. I think Melinda is quite right. We need to be making a step change in what we are giving the Ukrainian armed forces, heavy artillery, better weapons, longer-range missiles and so on, so they can go on being effective. But I think we've got to be really clear what we mean by doing more and stepping up. If we mean actually taking the war to Russia in Ukraine by NATO, then that risks Russian missiles on NATO territory, and we're on the escalatory ladder upwards. So I think we've got to absolutely step up our support for Ukraine, give them the most modern weapons we can, forget this old distinction that used to be between defensive weapons and offensive weapons. This is all about self-defense of people in Ukraine. But I do think that there is a difference between that and actually sending NATO troops to fight Russians in Ukraine.
Melinda, was your point earlier on really not so much that we want NATO boots on the ground, as I don't think there's any possibility of that, but was it about the weight of weaponry? I think there's a distinction people are making at the moment about light defensive weapons and heavy weapons, for example, planes that could be used essentially by the Ukrainians themselves.
That's exactly right. I think you have to go to Harvard Law School to see the fine distinction between escalatory weapons and defensive weapons. This is nonsense. When you're on the battlefield in Ukraine, they need as many weapons as possible. The systems that they're requesting now in particular are S-300s, the air defense systems. They need planes. They don't have very many. They need tanks. They need anti-ship missiles, drones, and then long-range artillery missiles for this next phase.
This is the great debate. Up next, has the international community done enough to deter Putin?
Together with our allies and our partners, we're going to keep raising the economic cost and ratchet up the pain for Putin.
The UN Human Rights Council has voted to suspend Russia, who is a permanent member of that Human Rights Council.
They have no right even to say human rights. And with this situation, I think we are very much welcome. We applaud.
And I'm Sky's climate change correspondent. The UK is a world leader in wind power. Power! Power! People! It's part of the Congo Basin rainforest, which is such an important ecosystem. It's known as the lungs of Africa. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. She doesn't really enjoy speaking to the press, and it wasn't clear right up until the last moment that she was going to sit down with me.
I might be just very naive, but I do believe that change is possible, otherwise we wouldn't be climate activists.
I'm confident for the last 30 years we have known how bad it is. I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to fight for the next step.
You can see just the piles and piles of stuff, these sofas and people's desks and children's books. And you can see inside this home here, people trying to sort out their home. It's just been devastating.
I think everything's at stake. The future of our planet, the future of the beauty around us, the future of you and me.
We support communities to grow food in lost and unloved spaces across the city. So our main kind of driving force is to get people growing.
con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas. Y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena. O sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
Welcome back to the great debate, where this week we're asking, is the West letting Vladimir Putin get away with it? After the horrors of the Second World War, there were two organisations which emerged to prevent anything like it happening again. NATO and the United Nations promised peace in Europe, but now face accusations of impotence in the face of Putin's aggression. Ukraine's president has regularly called on NATO, the world's most powerful military alliance, for support. And while some countries have answered that request, a coordinated response appears out of the grasp of the Ukrainian government. Let's jump straight back in with our viewers panel. I want to go to our friend David McCormack. Dave, good evening.
Good evening.
What's your thought on this point about international organisations?
Well, all I see is that United Nations and NATO seem to have meeting upon meeting to discuss further meetings, pre-meetings before the main meeting, and then post-meetings to discuss what was said in the main meeting. All NATO has done is tell Putin what they won't do. They are and have been helpless to stop and put an end to this war. Meanwhile, all the time, bombs and bullets are killing Ukrainians. Atrocities are being committed on a scale not yet truly uncovered. Their country and properties have been decimated, and Ukrainian families disbanded all over the globe. So it begs the question, has this war exposed NATO and the United Nations as to whether they are relevant and effective for a global crisis of this magnitude in today's world, or do they vastly need big reform?
Thank you very much, Dave. Well, that's pretty direct. Let's bring it back to the studio. Has this war exposed NATO and the United Nations as to whether they are relevant and effective in a global crisis of this magnitude in today's world? Tobias Ellwood.
I think absolutely right. I think our international rules-based order is being tested. It's worked well for the last few decades, but it's now completely wobbly and it easily is abused by both Russia and China. And this is the tipping point I think we need to recognise. There's something called the Thucydides trap, which is where a superpower is then challenged for its base, for its power, by an emerging power. And this is China, which in our lifetimes will militarily, technologically, economically grow bigger than the United States. It's not liked the international rules-based order. It's teamed up with Russia. Russia would not have invaded Ukraine had it not had the backing of China. We in the West need to wake up and recognize that Ukraine is just one part of this bigger jigsaw. The United Nations is a great example of an international rules-based organization unable to hold errant nations to account. In fact, China abuses these organizations. It abused the WHO, the World Health Organization, most critically the World Trade Organization as well. The West needs to wake up and stand up and repair these organizations.
Peter Ricketts, Tobias Ellwood has just destroyed most of your life's work by the sound of it. The rules-based order.
We need him back.
Bust.
Well, and Dave makes a very powerful point. But I would draw a distinction between the UN and NATO. The United Nations, set up in 1945, in order to get the Soviet Union and the Americans on board, had to accept this idea of a veto for the major powers. And so Russia has a veto in the Security Council. And so if there's an issue that concerns Russia or another permanent member of the Council, the UN is on the sidelines. That's absolutely right. It can't work because it's stymied. It's still useful as a sounding board for international opinion. NATO, I think Dave is wrong to say NATO's done nothing. NATO, this organisation of 30 countries that are committed to helping each other out if one is attacked, they've pushed at least 40,000 troops further forward towards Russia. They've strengthened all the countries around Russia in a way that Putin certainly would never have wanted, but Putin has drawn this down on himself. So NATO is stronger and more united, but NATO's job is to defend NATO allies. It's not NATO's job to go in and fight Russia in Ukraine.
OK, so far, no supporters of the United Nations in this studio. But let's go back to the panel and talk to Mikhailo Winitsky. Mikhailo, where do you stand on this? Do you think the international institutions have done their job?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm in Ukraine. I'm south of Kyiv at the moment, and I've been living through this war personally. And I think that it's much more important for us to be talking about the fantastic job that's being done by the Ukrainians on the ground than to be talking about who's to blame, the United Nations or NATO, etc. NATO countries have been helping Ukraine. We are very grateful for that. But at the end of the day, we understand that this is our war to fight. We will, and we have been victorious. We have been doing exceptionally well. We would very much ask for more weaponry. We understand that this is our war to win. Now, having said that, there is one point that I want to make. Very soon, and this is important because NATO, as Lord Ricketts has said very correctly, NATO is protecting its own eastern flank. Now, I was always under the impression that NATO not only protected its eastern flank, but NATO and protected this idea of European values and this idea of democracy and freedom.
Melinda, I'm going to come back to talk to Yasmin about this issue of values, but before we do that, what's your view about the way that particularly the United Nations has done its job here?
So I have zero expectations for the UN. So, you know, I can't evaluate them. I think the big disappointment and the big story that we missed is how poorly NATO has done. They've made a number of mistakes. Yes, there's great unity, but that's about all you can say. So they are scared to. They should have put a permanent rotation of troops in Eastern Europe a long time ago. They did not move enough troops to deter Putin. They talked about it. They moved a few. They had a meeting recently and they wrote a hand-clinging statement that said nothing, and they kicked the can down the road until June. I expected a lot more from NATO. And I think the big story, the scary thing, is there was an essay that came out today, an interview in an Italian paper, and it's with one of Vladimir Putin's closest advisors. And he basically says that Russia is not afraid of Article 5 guarantees, and that once they destroy Ukraine, they're going to Europe next. And Trevor, I was very skeptical of this claim. I thought that Vladimir Putin was afraid of Article 5 and the NATO guarantees, but it seems like he's not anymore. And, you know, Vladimir Putin is not the same man he was when he came into office at the end of '99. There's a lot of speculation that he's sick. I don't know if that's true or not, but he's definitely erratic.
Thank you. On our viewers panel, Natalie Bowers in East Sussex. Natalie, do you think that the international community's institutions could have done more to prevent us getting to where we are now?
Thanks, Trevor. Well, I'm taking a slightly different position on this one, and I do agree, though, reform is needed. But I think NATO have been strengthened by the unity that they've shown in the face of aggression towards a country which is outside of NATO, albeit on the border. It does seem to me that the UN have, and specifically the Security Council, have got the tougher job because, of course, Russia is one of the 5 states with the power of veto. And so I can't see how they can move much beyond condemnation and humanitarian aid.
Thank you very much indeed. I want to just stay there. Let's go to Tariq Ali. Tariq, what's your view?
Following on from the previous points, as Russia is a member of the Security Council and it has the veto powers, the Council cannot recommend the removal of Russia without its agreement. Effectively, Russia would need to approve its own sacking, a bit like asking Turkeys to vote for Christmas. Russia's veto makes a complete mockery of the United Nations Security Council. What are the panel's opinions, please?
Thank you very much, Tarek. Yasmin, if nothing else, the international institutions, particularly the United Nations, it's supposed to be there. It's got a Human Rights Council, all the rest of it, to protect people from brutality, torture and so on. Not much success in the last month or two, is it?
Well, I think, as Sir Peter noted very rightly, the fact that you have Russia on the Security Council means that taking any decisive action is extremely difficult. But what we have seen, in fact, is the UN and other international bodies, in fact, mobilising faster and states mobilising faster and more severely in this context than in other contexts. So, in fact, while it's not enough, what we're certainly seeing, we've seen the Human Rights Council has established a commission of inquiry which will hold and preserve evidence for future trials. We've seen the International Criminal Court open an investigation into crimes. So what we have seen actually is certain and very quick action in respect of Ukraine, but obviously there are questions about whether this is enough in relation to the situation.
Peter Ricketts, actually, I think the United Nations Human Rights Council kicked Russia off the council, didn't it?
Suspended it, yeah, which is obviously right, because it's a mockery to have Russia on a Human Rights Council, which is a selection of UN members supposed to be upholding human rights. But I think it's inevitably the case that if one permanent member of the UN, a major country, nuclear-armed country, is riding roughshod over the rules and ignoring them, then there's not a lot the Security Council can do about it. But the UN has this attraction, this value, which is it's universal. It's the place where global public opinion can be focused on an issue. And I think, therefore, to kick Russia out would be a mistake, because I think, in the end, we will need to be able to focus global opinion on Russia.
OK, this is the great debate. Coming up, the fight to keep the Russian people informed about the reality of the war.
5 seconds on state TV that millions will have watched. Protesting inside Russia tends not to end up well. Ukraine's enemies are heroes here, in Russia's towns and villages, as the country's losses grow.
Конечно, конечно.
ba ma dalee commencé liggéey bi yokkute bu bari am nañ ko ci.
This is the great debate, and we're asking, is the West letting Putin get away with it? Since Russia's invasion in February, the world's media have been telling the stories of Ukrainians caught in the conflict. But for the people of Russia, there's just one version of events available, the one permitted by the Kremlin. By shutting down independent news outlets and barring social media, Mr. Putin controls the narrative around what is happening in Ukraine. Earlier in this series, we heard from Konstantin, a Russian living in the United Kingdom. Konstantin told us how his family and friends believed that Russian troops were saving Ukrainians from a Nazi regime. He joins us again tonight. Konstantin, have they changed their mind at all?
Unfortunately not. The propaganda in Russia is still staying strong. Russian people who live outside of the country, who are protesting, who are donating to the causes against the war. We try to get to the minds of people inside the country, try to speak to them, but it's been extremely difficult. To the point where I, for example, had to cut off relationships with some of the friends whom I knew for decades because, this war is a red line. It's not something that you can accept, unfortunately, any longer. So it's still extremely difficult.
Do you, how would you sum this up? Do you have a question for our panel on this question?
If I may, I have a question about how can the West fight disinformation war, the propaganda in Russia?
Thank you very much for that, Konstantin. Let's see what our panel thinks. How can the West fight the information war in Russia? Melinda, what can we do?
Thanks, Trevor. First of all, Konstantin, I'm really proud of you for standing up and using your voice. We need more courageous Russians to do the same. So I think the West needs to get real about the size and scope of this problem and put real money behind a Russian language television station, probably based in Berlin, somewhere in Europe. And this would be run by people who know how to make real Russian language television. The attempts that I've seen are pretty wimpy and the content is not very good. So this idea is to bring all the Western governments together and put real money behind a big project. And this isn't a 3-year project. This is a 10 or 20-year project to be able to message to the Russian people and not only do news stories, but also do human interest stories and give them real unvarnished news in the Russian language.
Yasmin, how could we change, at least give the Russian people a diversity of narratives?
Well, yeah, I mean, the situation in Russia now is the worst it's been in decades in terms of repression. So what we're seeing is we've seen a crackdown on all media, all Western media are out. We've seen Russian media outlets have to close. Twitter and Facebook have been banned. In fact, Facebook has been declared to be an extremist organisation. And what we've also seen is thousands of people have been arrested and detained for merely protesting. And we know that you'll be in jail for 15 years for merely mentioning the word war. So there's an unprecedented suppression of people in Russia now. I think Western governments and all governments around the world have an obligation to be supporting Russian civil society to the extent that they can, whether that's, like the panel has said, whether that's through particular media outlets. Also, very importantly, I think, is providing safety for people in Russia who want to seek asylum, regularising their status in the UK, extending visas. We should be making sure that we are providing a safe haven and we are providing ample opportunity for people to hear the messages and to be able to speak freely and to be able to hear and listen to messages.
All right, let's talk to Alexandra. And I think, Alexandra, you can tell us about what is happening in Belarus.
Yes, good evening. I see myself as Ukrainian as I spent most of my life there, but I'm Russian by birth. When I contacted my cousin from Moscow, he said that my view on the war is just alternative, but he believes the Russian version of the war. But my sister from Belarus, though, is crying over the loss of life in this war, and she's saying the war is the wrong thing. She gets information from different sources, but anyway, she rather leans towards Russian view on the war, including Russian version that the photos from Bucha are staged by Hollywood. And it has been so painful for us to communicate on that finally we had to stop talking about Ukraine at all, which I'm not sure is the best decision in this case, because I still hope to tell the truth to her. How powerful and far-reaching the propaganda is so shocking, and I don't know what we can do to get through to people to make them see the truth.
Thank you, Alexandra. Tobias Elwood, we've talked a bit about weaponry, but actually the length of this conflict is dependent to some extent on what the Russian people are prepared to tolerate. This information war does matter, doesn't it?
Well, I disagree with that. I was shocked when I heard Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, say we must be prepared for this war to go on years. We can't accept that. We must help the Ukrainians defeat Russia in Ukraine by whatever means that are absolutely required without this escalating out of control. I think there was this assumption that with the might of the sanctions that went in, that somehow Putin a coup would take place, or he'd be purged, he'd be out. I think in the long term, that probably will be the case. That's how the Cold War ended, not because of the West's pressure, but because their own economy eventually collapsed. But Putin is there to stay for the moment.
Could we do better on this in this war?
We can certainly do better by widening the scope of it, yes, absolutely. And I think other countries around the world, like India, like South Africa, even like China, have to understand that there are big issues at stake here. And that to see a country smashing its neighbour in the way Russia is doing is a real threat to the rules that all countries need to live by and all benefit from. So, yes, we need to do that. And I think the information war is crucial. Putin has tried really hard to keep the truth out of Russia, because Putin is afraid of the truth. And he's built a firewall around Russia. But we have all kinds of techniques in our GCHQs, cyber techniques and so on. I'm sure we should be using them to try and get the truth in by social media, by the BBC World Service, any other way we can, because the truth is a big danger to Putin. And there must be a whole generation of young Russians who don't know what's going on, but are potentially capable of being opponents if they know.
Let's come back to the wall and talk to Ksenia. And we're not giving your surname. What do you think about this issue of how Russian opinion is informed more effectively?
Oh, well, that's a difficult question. And of course, it goes back not only to the last 20 years that Putin has been building this dictatorship system that includes not only media, but all other institutions, including government, courts, police, that all fall under one vertical of power that responds to only him. But it's also, I think, is in our cultural DNA historically, to have been through a long period of the authoritarian regime of the Soviet Union. And I think Russians, a lot of them, the majority of them, do not have the luxury of being able to think critically, to voice their opinion, or to stand up against the regime or against Putin, like many people in the Western world see it. It's not as simple as it might seem to be.
I think a dose of reality there. You're watching The Great Debate. Up next is the West standing on the right side of history.
X has been for some time a permitted option and in accordance with the international standards, but it's been down to individual nations if they want to actually incorporate the X into their own policy. And some countries chose to do that at an early stage, like New Zealand, Australia, and more recently Canada, Malta, and a number of countries in South America, Colombia, Argentina, Uruguay, and now the States, which I think will hopefully be a game changer. Whether that will make the UK government see sense and and get on the right side of history remains to be seen. But I've gone as far as I can in the legal system in this country. And so my legal team and I are going to be now taking the case to Strasbourg, although Strasbourg wouldn't be able to undo the UK ruling, as it were. But I'm hoping that it might be a wake-up call for countries that have, and I don't think there's anywhere that I know of that has been as slow to act as the UK, where this issue has been raised, because most governments can seem to accept that there is a need for ex-passports, and it's something that is basically very uncontroversial in that it doesn't harm anybody else. It's just giving people such as myself that I do not identify as male or female, and it means that I'd be able to have a neutral passport that wouldn't force me to declare an inappropriate gender and have to carry that passport, that document around, which is supposed to be an identity document, and it has a gendered reference that I don't identify with, and to me that's fundamentally wrong.
I'm Inzamam Rashid, and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent, telling stories from this culturally rich region I call home.
Con eso ya podemos ir evaluando entonces cómo el cambio climático va a afectar estos ecosistemas. Y eso cómo afecta prácticamente toda la cadena. O sea, si afectamos a los productores primarios, que son las microalgas, vamos a ver afectado obviamente todo el resto de los organismos.
Is the West letting Vladimir Putin get away with it? That's the topic of the great debate this week. History doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. Reports of alleged war crimes in Ukraine recall recent memories of genocide in Eastern Europe. And Europe as a whole vowed never to see the atrocities of World War II repeated. But as shocking images emerge from places like Bucha and Kramatorsk, calls for action against Putin and his forces grow stronger. Let's speak to the viewers panel and talk to Jackie Skip. Jackie.
Hi, Trevor. Currently, Putin is just ignoring all international rules, the way he's inflicting unimaginable suffering and committing atrocities against Ukrainians. I feel that there has to be some sort of retribution for the war crimes. And I wanted to ask, is there any way a peacekeeping force could now be put on the ground to prevent genocide?
Thank you, Jackie. Tobias Elwood, you've been in the aftermath, at least, of this kind of conflict. What do you think?
Yeah, I served under the UN banner, and it's premature to think of a peacekeeping force coming in. You need normally agreements on all sides. That normally happens once a truce has been confirmed. If you were bold about it, if we were more assertive about it, then you could, as I touched on earlier, have a peacekeeping force that takes over a humanitarian safe haven around the port of Odessa, for example, or those nuclear power plants that we saw. We didn't want them to be hit by anything. Again, the UN could have actually isolated those. A plume of anything coming out of there, if that was hit, would end up almost breaching Article 5, wandering across and causing damage in the West. I make the point, though, that ask yourself what Putin is trying to do in Ukraine. What does success look like in Ukraine? Until you answer that question, then you can't even place a UN peacekeeping force there. The bigger issue that we face is this turning point in the next 30 years or so of this axis between Russia and China. We talked earlier about the international rules-based order. They're not interested in it. They want to rewrite it. Authoritarianism doesn't sit well with the international rules-based order. We want more transparency, more democracy, more openness. That's exactly what President Xi and President Putin don't want. So we need to recognise stopping Putin in Ukraine, let me finish, is so important. Otherwise, this will go to Moldova, it'll go to Bosnia, back to Georgia, and then probably north as well.
Before we finish, I do want to address this question of, if you like, long-term history. But this, I'm going to come to you, Melinda, and I'll ask you, do you think that there is any space at all for in between where we are now and where what Peter Ricketts earlier in the programme more or less described as the catalyst for a conflagration that leads us to World War III? Is there a place in which something like a peacekeeping force could protect people without triggering world conflict and nuclear weapons and all of that?
Unfortunately, no. There's no way that you can put a peacekeeping mission in place right now. It's been tried a couple of times to put humanitarian corridors in, and the Russians just shoot at those people. If you look at Mariupol, which is down in southeastern Ukraine, it's been heavily shelled. The city's destroyed now. They can't get humanitarian vehicles in. The Russians simply won't let them. And there's horrific accounts of the Russians kidnapping children from Mariupol and sending them into Russia proper. It's just not possible unless there's a real ceasefire and Russia respects the rules, and it doesn't.
OK. Let's go back to Viewers Panel and talk to Anri Kikava. Anri, what do you make of this? Is there any way through this that you can see?
So I'm actually from Georgia, and my parents are from the region called Abkhazia, which was occupied by Russia in 1992. And upon the Russian occupation, my great-grandparents, they were actually murdered in a massacre. And these types of war crimes that are being committed are very similar to what's going on currently and what's been going on in the past few weeks in Bucha. So the fact that there's been about 30 years between what's gone on in Georgia and what's going on today in Bucha, and there's been no real change in the Russian actions is quite heartbreaking to see. Like, it's horrifying, to be honest.
Stay there, Henry. Yasmin, a warning from the past, really, that we've been here before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, obviously, there are many lessons that need to be learned. But also what has been learned is the importance of ensuring that that we document and that we ensure that the crimes that are being committed, there is accountability for those crimes, both as a deterrence but also for the victims of those crimes.
Peter Ricketts, this issue of being on the right or wrong side of history, Tobias Ellwood projected a future in which essentially big states, Russia and China, who don't really care very much about rules-based order, essentially say, we're going to be in charge. If in an alliance or in partnership or whatever, but we're going to run stuff if we can. Is that where we are?
Well, that's what I spent my entire career trying to avoid, certainly. I think the historians will look back and say we didn't do enough to deter Putin in years gone by. So when Putin invaded Georgia, we were in the middle of the financial crash and there wasn't a very strong reaction. When he went into the east of Ukraine, there were some reactions, but not enough to deter him. I think that's a fair cop. But I think now, honestly, the West has woken up. I think the reaction has been far stronger than Putin expected. It hasn't stopped him, the killing, but it has posed enormous cost, and we have thwarted his effort to overturn the government of Ukraine. Now the West has to take its role much more seriously. Look at a country like Germany, massively now increasing its defence spending, taking its role as a major power much more seriously. I think the countries of the West, but also include Australia, Japan, many others, that have an interest in the rules-based system, need to come together and be much more effective in the future in dealing with these authoritarian regimes.
Thank you all. And that is all that we have time for this evening. And indeed for this series of The Great Debate. Just remains for me to thank our panellists, Tobias Ellwood, Yasmin Ahmed, Peter Ricketts and Melinda Herring. And of course, I want to thank our viewers panel for their contributions tonight, and indeed, most of you for your contributions through this series, which has, frankly, made this show such a fantastic experience. I'm really grateful to you. And, of course, you at home, thank you for watching. We'll see you back here in the autumn for another series of The Great Debate.